Welcome to the Pacific Northwest and the Columbia River Basin. This 6-day voyage will take you down the Snake and Columbia Rivers, all the way down to the river mouth where it enters the Pacific. We'll start in a semi-arid desert and we'll finish in a temperate rainforest. This is the same route that Lewis and Clark took over 200 years ago. The National Geographic Quest is an ideal vessel to take us down these two rivers. We'll be descending 740 feet and transiting through 8 dams and locks. We have an expert team of staff who will be accompanying you, and this will be a great journey.
This morning we boarded jet boats in Clarkston, Washington, and we've come upstream, going south on the Snake River all the way into Hell's Canyon. Well, the landscape's getting more and more interesting to look at because of the changing fall colors. We have the crimson red of the sumac and the mulberry trees are turning golden. And along the way, we've been seeing some interesting wildlife, too.
It's a really stark landscape. I can imagine people discovering this area and just being awed by the sheerness of the walls, the ruggedness of the terrain, and I'm awed by it today. I'm awed by it today in 2018, so it's an awesome place to visit.
The agreement that I have with myself and that I share with the guests is if something turns my head, I have to take at least one picture of it. If something makes me go, wow, I've got to pay attention to that and take a picture of it. And I find that often those pictures, those first pictures, are really the best ones of the series of whatever I'm taking a shot of.
Here in Hell's Canyon, the geology is really interesting and challenging. The rocks are many different kinds, and they've been brought in here by tectonic plate motions, and as the plate came under the western side of North America, many different kinds of rocks from different places were smashed right onto the side of the continent in a process we call accretion. On the jet boats, we're able to go at high speeds right through rapids and through narrow places in the canyon. So this is a very exciting way to explore Hell's Canyon.
So this morning we've arrived at the confluence of the Snake and Palouse rivers. We'll be exploring the area by kayaks as well as zodiacs. There's been some beautiful diffuse light for photography. We've had some spectacular vistas that we'll be able to go out and capture while we're exploring. And we will also be passing by the Marmis Rock Shelter, which is evidence that humans have continuously inhabited this area since about 11,200 years ago.
Today we're in a very interesting area geologically speaking. When we look at the steep walls along the canyon sides here, what we're looking at is layer after layer after layer of basaltic lava flows. And you'll notice that they don't all look the same, and that's because a lava flow, some of these are very thick, and as they cool at different speeds, if they cool slowly, they can make what we call a colonnade of columnar jointing that forms like columns that are all lined up like a wall. And the reason we're able to see this beautiful cross-section of these lavas is because it's been eroded out by the Ice Age floods, and the water was so strong it could pluck big pieces, many ton boulders of this rock out and just haul it away.
Over the past century, this river has been modified by several sets of dams throughout the basin, over 150 in fact. Over the course of our voyage, we'll be transiting through 8 locks and dam systems, which have changed the ecosystem and the morphology of this river intensely. By the end of our journey, these locks will have lowered us a total of 740 feet to sea level.
This is the city of the Dalles, or we're on the edge of it, I should say. The Dalles was always an Indian fishing and hunting ground. It was kind of a bowl. They felt safe here. Later generations of pioneers came in, missionaries, naturalists. Before you know it, the Army was here, very important post having to do with Indian relations. And then the next wave of activity was the Oregon Trail major activity. And then a railroad was built here. It became a major center of railroad activity. But I suppose the traditional fisheries here was the major activity always in this Dalles. It was at Celilo Falls, which is about 10 miles east of where we're standing. Since then, the Dalles has changed a lot. Now it is, to believe it or not, a retirement community to a great deal. It also is a center of harvesting of cherries, maraschino cherries, and a lot of other fruits too.
Today we're at the Columbia Gorge Discovery Center. This is the most comprehensive museum with regards to the natural and cultural history of this area. Here we'll get a chance to see raptors up close and personal. We'll also get a chance to explore the outer grounds where they have an extensive collection of the local and native plant species.
This right here is one of my favorite plants in this region, the gray rabbit brush. Bright yellow flowers only come out in autumn. We get about 6 weeks of this beauty right here, and the rest of the year it blends in with its neighboring partner, the sage. It does have a beautiful color, but its scent is a little bit more sour, so it's great for observing from a distance, even on a day filled with a little bit of mist.
Today we're visiting Draper Girls Family Farm here in the Hood River Valley. The Hood River Valley encompasses a catchment that drains from the glacier and snowmelt waters of Mount Hood. It's quite arable and well known for its pears, apples, and beautiful orchards with grand vistas.
Well, today we're over in the Hood River area, and we've been out here today on this beautiful trail over the river. We've been looking at the different plants that are different from what we saw yesterday. Here's the big leaf maple, and some of them have leaves as big as dinner plates. Douglas fir, This is called the friendly fir because you can grab the limb, go ahead, and it doesn't prickle your hand so much that it hurts.
This is a ponderosa pine tree. You may be familiar with this if you live out in the west. They're pretty prolific species. We have them over in Colorado, New Mexico. They go pretty far up the coast. And the interesting thing about these trees, well, there's several interesting things really, but they're very, very well adapted to living in a climate that tends to have lots of fires. If you pick apart their bark, you can see it's got these very fine pancake-like layers to it. And what happens if a lot of heat attacks essentially this tree is that those pieces of bark will essentially get flicked off and carry the flames away with them and leave the inner cambium of the tree intact so it's still able to survive.
And also we've been looking at the basalt, which is what's making up all the rocks and cliffs right around here. We're in the Columbia River Basalt Province, which is a large area of what we call flood basalts that just erupted up out of the ground and ran across like hot molasses across the landscape, layer after layer.
Bonneville Dam was the first of a string of dams that were put on the Columbia River. And the idea was, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt and others. He was then President of the United States, anxious to get us out of the Depression. It was a job-producing activity, but it became more than that. It became a source of flood control, some irrigation, and of course, it offered some opportunities to move large vessels upriver and around rocks and falls and other impediments. But the Bonneville Dam today has been doubled in size. It produces enough electricity not only for this region, which is of course Eastern Oregon, parts of Washington, maybe a little of Idaho, but it sends it to California too. Once you get through Bonneville, you're on your way to the sea.
When we went through the Columbia Gorge, I was absolutely taken aback by the beauty of the hills and the greenery and the growth and the beautiful trees and the fact that all of this was growing on the accumulation of the beautiful soils and seeds over the years. And it just kind of gave you information about the transition of the earth from its formation to moving on into its greenery.
Today we're in Astoria, Oregon, and we are surrounded by a temperate rainforest. So the temperate weather here in the temperate rainforest allows for a lot of biodiversity in plants because the weather doesn't get too hot, it doesn't get too cold, and there's a lot of moisture in the air. And because of that, we have a lot of different plant species all around us. Some of the plants that you can find in a temperate rainforest are sword ferns. We have evergreen huckleberry. One of the dominant trees in the area here on the coast is the Sitka spruce. It gets really, really tall. It grows to huge, huge heights, and you can find all along the coast of these temperate rainforests.
We're at Fort Clatsop, about 10 miles from the mouth of the Columbia River. This was the third winter camp of the Corps of Discovery. The quest has been following a path of Lewis and Clark and kind of also following a path of others who followed Lewis and Clark, such as John Jacob Astor, fur traders, missionaries, and others. We finally made it. We came, of course, down the Snake River, which is now in Idaho, into what is the state of Washington and the state of Oregon, onto the Columbia River, and came all the way down through the Columbia Gorge, one of the grand places of the nation, with its waterfalls and high basalt walls. We emerged, of course, out of the gorge and into the low country. It's called the Coastal Range, and we're just on the edge of the Coastal Range that stares straight out at the Pacific Ocean, an ocean, by the way, that Lewis and Clark, Jefferson, and others called the Western Sea.
Seeing Fort Clatsop today was very exciting for me. I've read Stephen Ambrose's book, Undaunted Courage. In fact, I've read it twice, and it's a true voyage of discovery, equivalent of going to the moon, and seeing what these people went through to get here and then how they survived over the winter is just an incredible story of survival.
Lewis and Clark reached at this point, or near this point, the edge of the continent. They were looking out at the waves of the Pacific Ocean, and they were delighted because they could put their feet and their hands in what the Indians called a bad-tasting lake, meaning the salt content, and they could then report to Jefferson that they actually made it all the way across the continent.